So we're going to continue with the concept of understanding the self and how self-awareness and social understanding develop. So let's start with what do I mean by social cognition? So a social cognition is how children come to understand the multifaceted social world around them. So the way their understanding occurs, it starts from concrete to more abstract reasoning, similar to what we said with Piaget. It becomes more organized with age, and it goes from more simplistic to more complex understanding of what causes a behavior to occur. And then we start to work towards something called metacognition. And metacognition is just a fancy way of saying thinking about thought. So social cognition moves towards a more metacognitive understanding. So the understanding of the self goes all the way back to William James. And William James is one of the pioneers of psychology at its inception. And in fact, there is a debate who was more influential to psychology at its origin, Wilhelm Wundt or William James, because James is responsible for introducing the functionalist spirit of American psychology, whereas Wilhelm Wundt is known as the father of psychology. Now, William James talked about a lot of things: religion, spirituality, sensation and perception, emotions. But he also talked about this concept or the sense of self. And he said there are two types of selves that we should be aware of: the I self and the me self. The I self provides a sense of self as a knower and actor. So it is the active observer within a person, and it emerges before the me self. Whereas the me self looks at the self as an object of knowledge and evaluation. And this occurs through cognitive processes that arise from observation. And as I noted, the me self emerges after the I self. Let's continue. So the I self is involved in many different realizations, things like self-awareness, the recognition that the self is separate from all of the surrounding world and has an inner component not necessarily accessible by others. So understanding one's separateness from the world. Self-continuity is a sense of awareness that we remain relatively stable through time, or relatively the same through time. We develop a sense of self-coherence, which is a recognition that when we talk about the self, we're a single, consistent, bounded entity. And self-agency, which suggests that we have control over our thoughts and actions. Now, when we talk about the me self consists of qualities that make us unique, whether they be material characteristics such as our physical appearance or the possessions we have, psychological characteristics such as attitudes, beliefs, thoughts, and personality, or social characteristics such as the roles we have within society and the relationships with one another. So if we were going to put a graphic together, this is what the image would look like. The I self is awareness, continuity, coherence, and agency, recognition of one's uniqueness, whereas the me self is all about the physical, psychological, and social factors that we learned in lecture 1. Now, when we study the I self, let's look at the development of the self through time. At birth, infants notice that they are physically distinct from their surroundings, and infants respond with a stronger rooting reflex when stimulated by external stimuli. So there's a sense of separateness or distinctness that we have even at birth. And infants have the capacity for intermodal perception, and that is responsible for cohesion when we talk about cohesion. So even at birth, if we look at the rooting reflex and intermodal perception, that demonstrates the separateness of the individual relative to the social environment and the cohesion. So at 3 months, infants start to develop self-awareness. And here is an example of a study where they had infants shown video images of their kicking their legs, but they showed the legs being kicked from their point of view and from the observer's point of view. And in another comparison, they were shown normal leg positions versus reverse view of the legs. So the legs were turned backwards. And what they found was that infants looked longer at the observer's view than a reverse view. And that tells you that they know what they're supposed to see. They know um, what they're supposed to look like. And the conclusion of that study was that infants have the ability to distinguish between what they see and what others see. So let's continue. The I self develops as infants realize that their actions cause objects and people to react in predictable ways. Now, you may recall one of the things that the I self is about is developing self agency. So things like crying, if you have a responsive parent, are predictably going to bring the parent closer, right? So infants whose parents encourage exploration, respond to their signals sensitively, help with the sense of I self because it reinforces the power agency of the child. In your second year of life, you start to see the development of the me self. So toddlers are starting to become more conscious or consciously aware of their physical features. So one study was that with 9 to 24-year-old infants, they had them in front of a mirror and um, they put a dot right on the mirror. And what they found was that the younger infants rubbed the mirror, but by 15 months, children started to rub their face. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that they start to recognize it's them in the mirror. They recognize the awareness that they physically exist. So the dot on the mirror was not actually a dot on the mirror, it was somehow a mark on their face. So that demonstrated some awareness that they physically exist. Now, then you start to have self-recognition. So you're able to identify yourself as unique relative to other people. So 2-year-old and 3-year-old individuals can identify themselves in pictures. So if you have a picture of you and your kid, the kid might point to it and they might say I or me, or they might say their name. My daughter's name is Dossie, so that she might have pointed at 2 years old, like Dossie, Dossie, stating that she knows that that's her in the photo. We also develop self-conscious emotions, and we talked about that in a previous lesson, which are more high-order emotions that help us deal with a sense of self-awareness. We're able to start to take other people's perspective into account at this point. And then we're also able to demonstrate empathy, imitation, peer competition, cooperation. Now, what's interesting is you have in toddlerhood, you have something called mutual peer imitation, which is if you have a partner banging an object, like pretending to play drums, then the toddler will copy the behavior, and then the partner will imitate the child, and they'll keep this reciprocal copying going. We also develop the sense of a categorical and remembered self. So, a categorical self is when children start to classify themselves and others in terms of their age, gender, physical characteristics, and whether they were good or bad, or goodness or badness. Now, this tends to happen at about 1.5 years old to about 2.5 years old. So, they might identify themselves as boy, girl, bad boy, whatever it might be. They also develop self competencies, which is sort of like, I did it, right? So if they start to potty train, they might demonstrate a sense of pride for being successful in potty training. So that's the categorical self. The remembered self is more of your autobiographical memory. So it's a portrait of who you are, and that forms in the first few years. What is interesting about memory is that we don't have detailed memories before the age of 3. So there's a process called infantile amnesia. So we don't typically remember events that happened to us before the age of 3. Now, there are many reasons why, but the most common one, it has to do with the wiring in the brain. And we have this process of synaptic pruning and apoptosis, or programmed cell death, which eliminates some of these early memories. So if I were to ask you, when did you learn to walk? Most people learn to walk about 1 year old. And I would ask you, well, how do you know? Do you remember when you learned how to walk? You would probably say no to me. How do you know? The answer is that older individuals in your sphere, whether it be your parents or whatnot, tell you the story of when you learned how to walk or how you learned how to walk. But we rarely remember things before the age of 3. So remembered self is later to develop, and things like autobiographical memory is part of that. You also recognize that you have an inner self, which is an awareness that your thoughts are private and you can have your own imagination. So this is pretty cool because you start to recognize that your thoughts are distinct from other people. And as children think more about themselves and others, they develop a sense of theory of mind. And theory of mind is exactly what I said, is that there's a recognition that our thoughts are different, and you could take perspective taking and awareness of another person's point of view. Now, the inner self develops around 2.5 years of age, and it becomes more complex and more detailed with age. So let's look at mental states. So in the first year of life, children appreciate that people are animated beings. They move around. They're not still pictures. And they recognize that individuals' behavior is governed by goals, intention, desires, and feelings. So by 2 months old, children can distinguish between an animate object versus an inanimate object, a person versus a portrait, a toy cat versus a moving cat. By 3 months old, Children start to smile more at people than objects, demonstrating a preference towards animate objects. By 6 months old, we start to see some speech patterns that are directed at another person. Now, you may recall when we discussed language development that children say their first words on average at about 12, 13 months. But at 6 months old, that doesn't mean that children aren't cooing and babbling and using expressive jargon directed at another person, even though it's incomprehensible by the person who they're doing the speech towards. But what's interesting is that babbling has a purpose because it brings connection between the infant and whoever they're babbling. But by 6 months old, they understand that that has a purpose. By 1 year old, infants know that they have the capacity to affect another person's mental state. So if they cry, they can elicit things like frustration or panic in a caregiver. They know that by 1 year old. Now, by 2 years old, children have an even clearer understanding of emotions and desires, and they have the capacity to demonstrate empathy. So, we talked about this in a previous lesson, but if you watch in a playground preschoolers and you see a kid whose toy broke and they're really sad, you might see a 2 year old or a 3 year old take their toy and share it with the sad kid. And you might say, well, why did that kid share their toy with the other individual? It's because they could appreciate the sadness of that other individual. So that demonstrates a sense of empathy for the other person. By 3 years old, children develop an integrated awareness of mental states, and they're able to make connections between feelings and desires and perception. So, and they could combine all three. So, for example, if a person is happy to open a box, a child assumes that there's something exciting in the box. So they're able to see from you wanting to open the box and them seeing it, and your excitement, it becomes contagious. So they're able to see that if you're happy, they should be excited about it. And then this brings us to a desire theory of mind, which is they think that people act in ways that are consistent with their desires. What's interesting is that at 3 years old, they don't yet understand that beliefs have an effect on one's thoughts, right? So, they don't realize that one's thoughts and desires and emotions and behaviors can be inconsistent with one another. So when we talk about belief desire theory of mind, it's a more sophisticated way of viewing the mind that says beliefs and desires determine behavior. And this occurs at about 3 to 4 years old. And there becomes more of an effort to alter a person's belief as one gets older. So trying to alter one's belief, that might change their desires. So if you have a preschooler, a toddler, who goes to the supermarket and they want candy, and a parent says, no, I don't want to give you candy. So the parent expresses their desires not to buy candy for the kid. The kid might start to explain how this candy won't rot their teeth. Because if they could convince you, if they could change your belief about the candy, even if that wasn't your belief, But if they can think, hey, if I change the belief, I could change the desires. So they might start to give you rationales as to why uh, they should get the candy. Don't worry, this isn't going to rot my teeth. They also, by 3 and 4 year old, develop awareness of false beliefs. And that is to say that beliefs don't always match reality. Our thoughts don't match reality always. And let's just talk about a study that demonstrates this. So children who are 3 and 4 year old were shown 2 containers. And one container, the container was labeled Band-Aid. And in the other container, it was just a blank container, similar to the Band-Aid container, just didn't have a label on it. And the children were asked to pick the box that they felt the Band-Aids were in. And sure enough, children were able to pick the container that was labeled Band-Aid by 3 and 4 years old. Now, what the researcher did next was cool because it demonstrates false belief. So they open up the Band-Aid container and there's no Band-Aids in it. And then they open up the other box, the blank box, and there were the Band-Aids. So they wanted to see if children at the age of 3 or 4 could understand and modify based on false beliefs. So they introduced a puppet named Pam, and they said, well, which one do you think Pam would pick? And 3 and 4 year old, many 3 and 4 year old were able to grasp the concept of false beliefs and say that she would pick, even though it's correct that the Band-Aids are in a blank container, Pam would also pick the Band-Aid, one labeled Band-Aid, because it was labeled a certain way. So this is just a picture of the Band-Aid study. And the first phase was showing them the Band-Aid, the one labeled Band-Aid didn't have Band-Aids where the blank one did. And then the second one was the trial with the puppet. And that's really cool because children by 3 and 4 demonstrate they understand the concept of false beliefs. All right. So in terms of false beliefs, as one gets older, our awareness and understanding around false belief becomes even more secure, crystallized. Now children start to view beliefs as interpretations, not reality. So that is tremendous because that's a shift. Because originally they thought that there was a belief theory of mind and then a belief desire theory of mind. Now they're rejecting that notion altogether and suggesting that our beliefs are just interpretations of experience and it's subjective and it could be wrong. And by 7 years old, second order beliefs develop, and you develop an awareness that they can be wrong too. So second order beliefs are beliefs about other people's beliefs, right? So in that context, we might try and interpret another person's thoughts and feelings, but by 7 years old, we're able to recognize that maybe our interpretation about their thoughts and feelings are wrong. So self-concept is a general set of attributes, abilities, attitudes, and values that define who a person is. And as a child, we develop an appreciation for our inner worlds. And as that develops, we think more about ourselves, right? So let's talk about self-concept. The most common descriptors of self-concept used in early childhood are observable characteristics such as their physical appearance. But we start to also see description of oneself relative to one's thoughts and emotions or attitudes and emotions by 3.5. By middle childhood, so say around 8 to 11 years old, children start to organize their observations around typical behavior or general dispositions. So they start to focus on things like competency. Now, that shouldn't shock you because we talked about with Eric Erickson that in school age children, they're developing a sense of industry versus inferiority. So industry would be competency. So now children might say, I'm a good pianist, right? So they're able to play the piano really well. They're also able to understand both positive and negative attributes that they have, right? So both for themselves and other people, but they might say that I'm really I get upset easy, right? So they're able to understand their emotional reactivity, things like that. And another thing that happens in relation to self concept in middle childhood, which is propelled by being in school, is the concept of social comparisons. And social comparisons occur when children start to judge themselves relative to other individuals, whether it be their appearance, ability, or behaviors. In adolescence, self concept becomes more abstract. So they're able to view themselves in more theoretical ways. And they're also able to see themselves in more complex ways. Things like contradictory descriptions are acceptable if they're talking about different aspects of the person. They might use qualifiers, right, to describe psychological qualities, and they might recognize that these qualities can change from situation to situation, right? So I'm really organized when my girlfriend is around, but I tend to be much more messy when she's not. Things like that. So recognizing um, attributes of the self and how they change across situation. We also see a sense of focus on social virtues, and we talked about in adolescence one of the important things of cognition is to make a difference on the world. They have this utopian view of the world. There's an emphasis, there's a naivete where they want things to be perfect, a perfect world, a cooperative world. So they view themselves with similar lens as they view the world, trying to describe themselves with social virtues such as being friendly, kind, cooperative, and so forth. Now let's talk about self-esteem. So self-esteem is judgments about our worth and feelings around these judgments. So if a person says, I am worthless, that would be a person who has low self-esteem. If a person says, no, I'm a very important person, I have value, they have high self-esteem. And if a person has high self-esteem, they have a realistic evaluation of the characteristics, attitudes, and they view themselves with self-respect. Whereas low self-esteem, it's a more negative self-judgment. Now, self-esteem is important because how we view ourselves is going to affect us long term. It's going to affect our effort in the classroom. It's going to affect our emotions. It's going to affect our overall adjustment. It's going to affect how we relate to others in romantic relationships and so forth. Now, there are 4 factors that are linked to self-esteem. and this is the hierarchical structure of self-esteem. One is academic competence. So the jock, pardon me, the geek. I'll get to the jock in a minute. Academic competence is the geek, so a person who excels in classwork. Social competence, the class president. So this is how friendly and how liked they are by their peers and presence. Then we have physical competence, which is the jock. And I put these in quotes because these are labels that might go according to that person. So that might be their athletic abilities, how well they play sports, and then their physical appearance, hot or not, right? These are factors linked to self-esteem. And the more favorable you see yourself in these four factors, the stronger your self-esteem. So here's just a hierarchy or flow chart that puts them all together. So you have your academic, social, physical competence, and then a physical appearance. And each of them play a role. All right. Now, our self-esteem changes through time. I think that's important to understand. So children start having a difficulty distinguishing between their desired competence and their actual competence. So it's oftentimes people will overestimate their ability and underestimate the level of difficulty of a task. So we see that in some ways serves as to protect our self-esteem. So we distort things in our favor. Now, as children get older, they engage in social comparison, and they start to adjust their self-esteem to a more realistic level in comparison with others. But as I said, we tend to be protective of our self-esteem. So we might modify our personal achievement goals to make us feel better. So, what are some factors that influence self-esteem? So, self-esteem starts very variable, but by adolescence, self-esteem becomes increasingly stable. And factors that play a role in this are activities, experiencing success in the classroom, having friendships, doing well in sporting events, finding success results in feeling greater self-esteem. Now, if you have positive self-esteem profiles, you tend to be more well-adjusted, sociable, conscientious, and so forth. Now, there are many factors that could influence self-esteem. Things like culture profoundly impact self-esteem. So if you are part of a culture that has a strong emphasis on social comparison in the school system, that might play a role in one's self-esteem. So, for example, in East Asian cultures, they put a strong emphasis on academic achievement, and there's a strong emphasis in social comparison in academic achievement. So if you compare self-esteem scores for Chinese and Japanese children, they tend to report lower self-esteem than American children who put less of an emphasis on academic achievement and social comparison. We also have the effect of gender stereotyped expectations and how that affects self-esteem. So one's level of physical attractiveness, athletic prowess tend to and achievement, these factors tend to undermine young girls' self-esteem, right? So there's a bias against young girls in terms of self-esteem. Parenting practices play a role in building self-esteem. So if you are a child or adolescent who has a parent who's encouraging, warm, supportive, and they set reasonable goals and expectations for you, you're going to develop very strong self-esteem. You're going to develop a sense of competency. Whereas when you have parents who are overly helpful or make the decisions for a child, then that child is going to suffer from lower self-esteem because they never had the opportunity to explore and make decisions. So setting reasonably high expectations for your child, but coupling that with warmth is going to create competency and high self-esteem. Now, so making the decisions for the child sets them up for low self-esteem, but those permissive parents who want to be friends with their children, so they're overly tolerant, or those parents who are overly indulgent, tend to artificially inflate their children's self-esteem more than they really are. So if you have low bars and you have all that warmth for the child, then you might also undermine the child's development of self-esteem because you're artificially inflating their ego. So if you ask me about parenting and building self-esteem, the best way to build self-esteem in children is to be warm and supportive of your children, but hold them to age-appropriate expectations. Don't let them get away with saying, I can't do this, and getting C's on their report card if they're capable of A's. So hold them to task, but in a loving and supportive way, because when they succeed, they learn to feel better about themselves and they develop a sense of self-esteem. Now, I will say that if you hold them to too high of a bar that's beyond their capability, you could also sabotage their self-esteem. So make sure that it's age appropriate in terms of the goals and competency. Now, if we're talking about achievement related attribution, so an achievement motivation is to persist at challenging tasks to want to succeed. So research on achievement related attribution has identified that adult messages that we give affect the child's self-esteem and achievement motivation. So if you give harshly critical messaging to a child, you're actually going to undermine their self-esteem, but you're going to also undermine their motivation to persist when they have challenging tasks. I have a family member whose daughter is now in the third grade, not third grade, ninth grade. And her daughter is rambunctious. She's fairly opinionated. She was diagnosed with ADHD, but she's really, really smart. The problem is her mother is harshly critical of her and always finds fault in her daughter. And when she does this, it really demoralizes her daughter. So what we found is that her daughter winds up not working very hard on her work. She gives half the effort that she needs to, or she'll submit assignments without checking her work, or she won't submit assignments at all. And that happened because her mother chipped away at her self-esteem for so long that she doesn't even bother trying as much as she could. And she could succeed if not for the negative messaging she has. So it's interesting that self-esteem plays a role on achievement motivation as well. Now, during middle childhood, so the elementary school years, children have the ability to distinguish between effort, external factors that lead to success or factor, and their general ability. They have that ability to recognize these. Now, when we talk about learned helplessness, and we'll get there, we have to talk about the difference between mastery-oriented children versus learned helplessness children. So mastery-oriented attributions refer to those who are high in achievement and give themselves credit for their success or abilities. So they take responsibility for their success. Mastery-oriented attribution puts a strong emphasis on ability, which is a characteristic that can improve through trying hard and persisting when one has challenges and facing those challenges head on. Now, in terms of development of ability, it's also important to understand that abilities develop in an incremental way. So an incremental view of ability suggests that your ability, your competency can improve with effort. And when we look at mastery-oriented children, they understand that if they put more effort in, they will be successful. Even when they have negative events or negative outcomes, they continue to try harder because they believe that they have the capacity to change the outcome, to improve their ability, even if something is difficult. Learned helplessness is where a child attribute their failures to their ability, but not their successes. So a learned helplessness, a person takes every one of their failures and then they say it's because I lack ability. And when they succeed, they say it's due to luck rather than ability. So a mastery-oriented child puts an emphasis on their success or the drive for success and ability, where learned helplessness-based children tend to put an emphasis on their failures, and then they attribute that to their abilities. So when we talk about an incremental view, that means that mastery can occur with effort, where an entity view of ability, the belief is that ability cannot be changed. You either have it or you don't. So competence in this mindset cannot be improved. And what we see is children who have a mindset of learned helplessness tend to have an entity view of ability so that they don't try as hard because why bother? By adolescence, you have a fully developed awareness, differentiation between ability and effort. Well, those who have a learned helplessness mindset will quickly conclude that mastering a challenging task is not worth the cost provided because it's extremely large effort, so they quit. So I want you to think about this, right? So ability and effort are related. And if you have a learned helplessness mindset, you say, well, I don't have the ability, and I would have to put a lot of effort in even acquiring marginal ability. Why bother? I quit. Whereas mastery-oriented children say the effort is worth the final success. And if you look at this, it's fairly sad when we look at the flow chart, right? So achievement related attributions. For mastery oriented children, success is due to ability, failure is due to lack of effort. Mastery oriented children tend to have an incremental view of ability, which suggests that it can improve with greater effort. Mastery oriented children have high expectation for success, and they put the emphasis on learning rather than outcomes. Whereas learned helplessness oriented children, they tend to view their success due to luck, whereas their failure is due to ability. And instead of having an incremental view, they have an entity view. And learned helplessness children have very low expectation for success, and they put an emphasis on the outcome or the performance rather than the process of learning, and that sets them up for avoidance of challenging tasks. So if we look at the influences on achievement related attributions, the negative influences are as follows. So children who experience negative feedback about their ability, messages that evaluate their traits, pressure to perform, or receive a lack of support from their teachers are likely to develop learned helplessness. Whereas if you want to shift a person towards a mastery orientation, some positive influences are teachers who are supportive, caring, helpful. They emphasize the learning process over the goals, over performance. They stress interpersonal harmony rather than competition. These individuals are going to promote a master orientation. And then when we look at attributions, we have something called attribution retaining, which is an intervention that encourages individuals who had learned helplessness to rewrite the narrative. So the goal is to retrain them, to teach them that they can overcome their failures through exerting more effort. And this tends to improve self-evaluation of low learned helplessness children. The next thing we want to talk about is identity. And identity has to do with who am I or who should I become. And when we talk about identity, the first psychologist or psychoanalyst to talk about identity as a personality feature was Erik Erikson. And he felt that identity occurs in a gradual process, in a stage-like fashion. It comes to a head in adolescence, but your sense of identity influences how you relate to the world even as an adult. So in complex societies, there's a process of exploration, trying things out to figure out who you are or who you want to become. And that search for identity, search for self, usually results in identity achievement. But not everyone gets there, right? So let's talk about James Marcia, who took Erik Erikson's idea of identity achievement, or identity, pardon me, in adolescence, and he builds on Erikson's work to talk about 4 paths of identity, and he even creates a measure to determine which identity model one most belongs to. So identity achievement, which is the goal, usually happens in late adolescence or emerging adulthood. And this is where a person has a set view on themselves, a commitment to who they are after exploring different options. So there's high levels of exploration, which result in high levels of commitment to one's values and beliefs. Whereas identity moratorium is high levels of exploration and low levels of commitment. So there's a search for the self and identity, but no commitment. Identity foreclosure happens when you have high levels of commitment to an identity or value system with very little search or exploration. In very traditional cultures, you see high levels of identity foreclosure. Now, identity diffusion, you have low levels of exploration and low levels of commitment, right? It's interesting that this is according to James Marcia, this is a process of finding oneself. And we see that through adolescence and emerging adulthood, one eventually, or most people eventually, find themselves. They find who they are, and they commit to a set value system. And high school and college give you a great opportunity to explore and try things out to figure out who you are and who you want to be. So now let's talk a little bit about thinking about other people. So person perception refers to how we understand the attributes of other people whom we are familiar with. And like self-concept, when looking at other people, we tend to put an emphasis on personality attributes. Now, what's interesting is that we have something called the fundamental attribution error, which is more common in Western societies than collectivistic societies. But in Western societies, the fundamental attribution error is when we look at other people's behaviors, we overestimate the outcome as being personality, and we ignore the environmental context. So, for example, if we had a person who was invited to a job interview and they came 15 or 20 minutes late to a job interview, the default assumption is that they didn't care about the job. They didn't value the interview. When in reality, you never know. They could be taking a bus and the bus could have been late, or the bus could have not shown up, and they gave themselves enough time, but they still cared enough that they still showed up even though they were late. So we tend to ignore the context. We don't even ask enough. With ourselves, we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, but when we look at other people, we're more likely to make the fundamental attribution error, which is overestimating personality, underestimating the environmental factors or context. Now, understanding things like ethnicity and social class in preschool, the basic concepts of race and ethnicity emerge, and children can distinguish between these characteristics. Children can distinguish between rich and poor, even in preschool. Now, they may not fully understand the social meaning of that, but they will understand it. They will understand that there are differences in skin tone, and they'll understand there are differences based on finances. By your early school years, children tend to adopt or absorb the prevailing attitudes towards social groups. And so that's very important to think about the cultures that we raise our kids in. So if we raise our kids in a culture that acknowledges social injustice and is sensitive to social injustice, our children, even in school age years, are going to be able to show more empathy. But if children are raised in households of bigotry, racism, they're also going to adopt those racist or bigoted attitudes early in school age years. So you wonder how is it that a young child could demonstrate racist attitudes? Well, what we tend to see in the school age children, they just adopt the general worldview around them rather than questioning it. Now, they will eventually question it, but it may be too late for some. All right. Now, in terms of these attitudes, they don't always necessarily adopt these attitudes of the parents or friends, but they pick up information from the macro culture. They might pick up implicit messaging from their surroundings. So let's talk about in group and out group biases and the development of prejudice. So whites or Caucasians versus ethnic minorities. We tend to see white children who had little experience with ethnic minorities tend to show an in-group favoritism and out-group prejudice by 5 years old. That is to say, if you have a child that has minimal exposure to ethnic minorities, they're going to have a natural bias or preference towards white children. And they're going to have a natural bias or negative bias or prejudice against ethnic minorities. And how does that happen? Well, that happens because they don't, at this point, question the macro culture. Whereas if you absorb children, if you have children absorbed in a culture's ethnic stereotypes, many ethnic minority children show the reverse bias. So ethnic minority children, knowing that there's prejudice against their group, show an out-group favoritism, so they may actually prefer the white majority as well. And there's the famous study, Brown versus the Board of Ed, in which Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark demonstrated and gave testimony to the fact that young children would prefer the white doll over the black doll. And it didn't matter whether it was a white child or a black child. Both white children and black children preferred the white doll. And this was in the 1950s, pre-integration. But when they asked the black children, why did they choose the white doll? Because the children tended to give negative descriptors of the black doll. It's ugly. It's loathsome. And I don't think they use the word loathsome, but things like that, because ethnic minorities are also receiving the stereotypes about their culture and they want to be embraced. So they might have an out-group favoritism. All right. By middle childhood, we have the capacity to classify the social world in multiple ways. So here's where we start to shift our focus and shift away from prejudice, which is a good thing. We start to explore differences. If you have children who viewed personality as relatively fixed, if they had high self-esteem and experience the social world in a way that sorts people into groups, they tend to have greater prejudices, ethnic prejudice, though. So these are the attributes of prejudice. Now, continuing to talk about in-group bias, right? So Again, in-group bias, in-group favoritism, I should say, is preference towards one's own group. Out-group bias is a negative prejudice against one's group, against, another group. Now, we can reduce prejudice. And one of the ways to reduce prejudice is to have intergroup contact and collaboration. The more you relate to individuals who are different than you, the more likely you're going to learn to reject prejudice. Now, this idea has been adopted in many parts of the world. In Ireland, when they were having fighting between Northern Ireland and Ireland, they had kids play soccer together to learn that, hey, maybe this person isn't bad, maybe they're just like me. And South Africa, during apartheid, they did the same thing. And with the Israelis and the Palestinians, there's a group doing ballroom dancing, trying to teach these young kids that the individual that they view as the enemy or the other, or they have prejudicial attitudes towards, they are just like them. They want the same things. They want happiness. They want love. They want respect. They want freedom. And by interacting with people who are different, you learn that maybe they're not as different as I thought. Maybe my prejudice, it needs to be checked. So one way to reduce prejudice is to have intergroup contact and collaboration. Now, another thing we have in terms of the view of the self is perspective taking. Now, perspective taking is the ability to understand what other people might be thinking or feeling, or understanding their point of view. And this improves in childhood and adolescence. And around 6 years old, children understand that previous knowledge affects one's ability to understand new information. And they understand by 6 to 8 years old that their pre-existing beliefs can impact their viewpoint. So Robert Selman talks about a 5-stage process or sequence by which people develop perspective-taking skills that are based on a children and adolescents' response to social dilemmas. So when we talk about level 0, so to speak, you have an undifferentiated perspective taking. So this is typically individuals who are between the ages of 3 to 6. And at this point, children recognize that the self and other can have different thoughts or feelings, but they frequently confuse the two. So undifferentiated, they mix up their feelings versus another person's feelings. Level 1 perspective taking, which is called the social information perspective taking, that occurs at the age of 4 to 9. And by this point, children understand that different perspectives may result because different people have different access to different information. So if you have access to more information, your perspective might change. So the information processing is built in. Level 2 is self-reflective perspective taking, and that occurs between the ages of 7 to 12. So at this point, children can step into another person's shoes and start to view their own thoughts, feelings, and behavior through that other person's perspective. And then by level 3, which is ages 10 to 15, that's third-party perspective taking. So now they can imagine as an outside point of view of two-person situations and imagine what it might be to give advice from that impartial point of view. And then last but not least, level 4 is social perspective taking, or societal perspective taking, pardon me. and that is ages 14 to adulthood. So that's adolescence through adulthood. Now, at this point, we recognize that third party perspective taking can be influenced by many different value systems within a larger society and the societal values. So a third person's point of view could be influenced by society's values. And here's a breakdown of the various levels and a summary. Now, recursive thought. Recursive thought, another assessment of perspective taking is recursive thought. And this is a form of perspective taking that involves thinking about what another person is thinking, the ability to understand a person's point of view, and that contributes to many social skills related to peer acceptance. So if we look at having strong recursive thought, it's good because individuals who tend to be described as angry or aggressive, young children or adults, tend to have difficulty imagining the thoughts and feelings of others. So, but it can be taught. So there are interventions that teach perspective taking skills to reduce antisocial behavior and increase pro-social behavior. So one loop recursion is this boy is thinking that he is thinking about himself, right? Whereas two loop recursion is the boy is thinking that the girl is thinking of the father thinking of the mother. So now notice one loop is thinking about a person thinking about themselves. Two loop is thinking about another person thinking about the thoughts of an additional member of society. We also have social problem solving. Again, here we are still talking about the self, right? Right, and identity. So social problem solving is the ability to develop application of strategies to prevent and resolve disagreements, and which results in outcomes that are acceptable to others and also beneficial to oneself. So as one gets older, they become better at social problem solving. And this relies heavily on practical intelligence. So the goal is to address a problem involving another person while making sure that one's own needs are met. So components of social problem solving include the ability to encode and interpret social cues, clarify social goals, generating and evaluating strategies, and enacting responses that are more likely going to be accepted. These skills tend to develop in middle childhood and result in better friendships, peer relations, and academic performance. And then this is just a model that shows you social problem solving. So you need to identify the social cues, interpret them, formulate a goal, offer up certain strategies, evaluate whether those strategies will work or not. If they don't work, go back to generating new ones. But if they do work, enact a response that's pro-social. And that is today's lesson. So I'm going to stop here and we'll continue next week.